Thanks for joining us for ACPA's webinar with leadership discussing careers in student affairs day or month, and just a pleasure to have you all here. My name is Craig Elliott, and pronouns are he, him, his, and I work at Samuel Merritt University in Oakland, California, and I'm currently serving as the Vice President for ACPA, and just thrilled to have you here. I'm here with some of the best and brightest of the next generation of our student affairs professionals, and so I'm just honored to share this space with the three of you. So let's if we can go around and do introductions, and let's start with you, Connie.
Great. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, awesome. So hi, everybody. My name is Connie Cabello. I go by Connie for short. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I work at Stonehill College right outside of Boston, Massachusetts, home of the World Series champs. I am at Stonehill College. I'm the assistant to the president for institutional diversity and director of intercultural affairs here. And I'm fairly new to ACPA, and so very thankful to be invited to be part of this chat with you all today, and looking forward to getting more involved and welcoming the convention here to Boston in just a few short months. Thanks.
All right, Gabe.
Good afternoon, everyone on the East Coast. Good morning, otherwise. My name is Gabe Marenco-Garcia, and I use he, him, and his pronouns. Outside of ACPA, so in my everyday role in the walls around me, I serve as one of the associate directors in the Office of Student Affairs at the University of Pennsylvania. A lot of my role, and I even tell people this, is that it's a little misnomer. Our office acknowledges that, since I know a lot of places call their division Student Affairs. But our office is a little bit of a catch-all office under the Division of University Life at Penn. And so we have what many would maybe have like a combination of student government, student activities and involvement, leadership programs, and family programs and initiative kind of tied and bundled into one. So that's my role here at Penn. With ACPA, I've been a part of ACPA for almost 6 years now, since I was in grad school, and currently I serve as the chair-elect for the Grad Students and New Professionals Committee of Practice.
Thanks, Gabe. All right, Shruti.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shruti Desai. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I work at McKendree University. It's right outside of St. Louis, Missouri, but actually in Illinois. And I serve as Assistant Vice President for Student Affairs there. My relationship with ACPA has been on again, off again. It's complicated, I guess. So I'm excited to be part of this time with y'all and look forward to our conversation.
Excellent. Well, again, thank you to the three of you for your presence and your work and being here today, but also in the association and working to make a difference. So let's be brave and bold and jump in. And I think just for context of for those chiming in, I think what we were hoping to do is really to take this opportunity to explore careers in student affairs, not just kind of from a lens of who we are and how we got into the profession, but more about how we are seeing student affairs transform, how we were hoping student affairs will transform, and how we are working to transform student affairs along the way. And some of that is in connection with kind of centering student affairs in justice and love and a plurality of voices and identities, and so that our profession really truly is serving students from all perspectives and identities and backgrounds and experiences, and not just framed from the white male perspective, and then tried to customize it to accommodate other voices and needs. And I think from each of our critiques of student affairs in higher education has been really that it is a model, it's an old model, it's a model centered on a population of students that doesn't currently exist anymore. And so with that, we want to really be talking about what are we doing, how are we seeing the profession really transform and change, and how do we need it to be, and that we be unapologetic for our work for justice and equity, and that learning-centered experiences for all students. And so I think, so just jumping in, love to just hear our panel's perspectives on what does the next iteration of student affairs look like and feel like. So Shruti, can I ask you to just jump in on that one?
Sure. Thanks, Craig. Yeah, so I think you have a good point. I think what we've done is, if you think about higher education as like a plumbing system, what we've done is replace old copper pipes with plastic plumbing instead of completely redesigning the plumbing system. And I'm hoping that as we have this next group and kind of my group come up the ranks, we're going to redesign the plumbing, take it out, bust up some basement ground, and like, let's put in new plumbing. Because I think what we've done is create systems for kind of the old school average student, white, upper class, middle, Christian, cisgendered, straight student, and said, okay, let's add a program here, let's add a program there. But the demographic of the student is changing dramatically. More first gen, more queer, more students of color, more low income, immigrant kind of student. And we can't take something that has been created for dominant identity groups and expect to like make some small changes here and there and adjust it to a whole new population of students. But I think that requires us to shift how we spend resources, to shift how we hire, to shift how we supervise, and even our physical infrastructure has to shift. So this idea of design, universal design learning, how do we center, instead of adding these folks as a la carte item, how do we center folks in the margins versus keeping kind of dominant norms in the center and then saying, let's build around it.
Beautiful. Gabe, do you have thoughts that you want to offer?
Yeah, I think one of the pieces, to add on to Shruti's point is even looking from the very beginning, right, of how many of us originally entered this field through a graduate program traditionally, so to speak, and focusing on what are those knowledge, skills, and competencies reflecting in the classroom, and how does that translate in the years shortly after that graduate program? And I say that because I think also our traditional teachings have maybe focused on long-term goals and roles that may come way farther down in our careers, and for some of us may truthfully not explore those roles, and maybe okay with sticking to a mid-manager role for quite some time, what have you. And so I think our programs need to shift the mindset of yes, the everyday happenings, legal issues, etc., that our senior leadership experiences at institutions is very stressful, I can only imagine. But more importantly, for those of us, again, that are going into these entry-level or mid-manager roles, I think shifting the teachings and the knowledge and skills to focus on the Shruti's point a little bit of what are some of the boots on the ground work right now, and as we know, even as of this weekend, current events and unfortunate tragedies and things that are affecting our student population, how do we ensure that we're centering our understanding of approaching these difficult conversations with our students, but also within ourselves? And so I think that's one way for me looking at the graduate program work that needs to shift in order for us to continue to prepare professionals or future emerging professionals better for the work that is actually happening every day.
Mm-hmm.
Great. And Constance?
Yeah, just Constanza. Another thing that I would like to add is that, I think for us, it's really important that we often just kind of do these programs and add them on and just say, oh, we've done diversity. But to Shruti's point, it's not just about programs. It's also about policies and practices. And so often we're just looking at how can we adjust a program to fit marginalized communities. It's also about how are we looking at the policies that we currently have and how they're systematically designed to disenfranchise certain populations. And whether that's a policy, whether that's an enrollment policy, whether it's a housing policy, how are we maintaining systems of oppression really in our policies? And those are the things that are hard to change. I mean, it's a little bit easier, to pull together a program and say, hey, we're doing something for these marginalized groups, but how are we actually changing the infrastructure of our colleges and universities? And I think that's the work that's really hard to do, and that we really need some strong leadership in. And I think about, my graduate training. I had more training on how to put together a program than how to change policy. And so I think that's something worth exploring more.
That's great. And thank you for the correction on your name. I apologize for that. I was trying to use your professional name and I messed it up. So I apologize. Thank you. I appreciate that. So I think it's a really great transition into like our next question. And I think how are we learning about policy change, and how are we learning to shift systems of oppression? So it prompts me to say, I think that we may not always know how systems that we have might be oppressive. And so I think it would be, so a question back to you all would be, what are some concrete examples, without names and institutions, please, of the things that we're seeing that are really oppressive systems that have been normalized, so that we can then begin to identify, like, hey, these are things that we really want to take a look at changing and shifting into more justice-oriented ways. So I will leave that out there for anybody who might be ready to share an example of two.
I can jump in if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I have the opportunity to come up through Res Life, and I think Res Life is like a very well-intentioned place most of the time. But I think about some of the things that we do. So the way we do housing assignments, and the first people who get housing assignments are the people who put their deposits down. And we think about who's coming up through the pipeline. And so if it's first gen students, if it's low income students, coming up with the extra $200, $400, $600 in a very expensive time of college apps, other deposits, things like that, is a challenge. And so you see when these students get to campus, you see this automatic segregation that happens of, like, the upper class folks, oftentimes the white folks, are in like the fancy res halls because they got first dibs, and then our low income first gen students are in traditional halls because they came later. And oftentimes scholarships don't cover that, financial aid doesn't cover that. And so we continue to create this have-not system. I think about like our student behavior teams, our care teams, BIT teams. Oftentimes we say, let's refer students off campus for continued therapy because we don't have the capacity to do it. We're assuming that our students can pay co-pays. We're assuming that our students have good insurance. We're assuming that they have cars. And so there's these built-in normative things, particularly around class and ability and gender and race, that we just assume and build policies off of, instead of saying, like, okay, let's assume that most of our students can't afford their copay or don't have insurance or don't have transportation. How do our policies reflect that? And I know the struggle of policy of, like, we have these government mandates, this liability, our legal counsel in our ear telling us this is not okay, this is illegal, while we're trying to push our values and live our values as a university and as practitioners committed to, like, diversity and inclusion. So it's a tough balance and a tough fight that we fight.
Thank you, Shruti. Connie, do you have any thoughts to add or examples?
I think those are really good examples, and I'm thinking about additional examples of how some of our practices really do further marginalize our communities on campus. And the one that sticks out for me is, right now there's a lot of talk, I think, in student affairs about these co-curricular transcripts and achievement records, and I have a real problem with that, because what they really are access records. And so, we're giving students credit for being student leaders and for being able to participate in study abroad and service trips, but a lot of our students don't have that opportunity because they have additional responsibilities. And so For me, that's really something that we need to critique a little bit more, is that how are the ways in which we're rewarding students for their access, whether it's through achievement records, their co-curricular transcripts. I'm sure a lot of our campuses have kind of student life awards or those kinds of things. How are we actually acknowledging the students who are, taking care of a parent 20 hours a week, or taking care of a younger sibling, or, volunteer with community organizations? I think that's something that I've been thinking a lot about, is in this effort to kind of, with these co-curricular transcripts, and trying to, really what they are a way for us to pull data about our students. But how are we actually using that as a tool to say this is actually more about access and opportunity rather than leadership and skill? So that's something that I'd like us to look more into as a field and a profession, and thinking about what are the ways that our students are actually demonstrating leadership, involvement, civic engagement in ways that maybe aren't traditionally seen as leadership on our campus.
Yeah, I think so many times with these examples, we reinforce, right, this concept of oppressive systems through multiple experiences in their collegiate career. And I say that from a more activities involvement mindset or background, even with sometimes our student organizations, right? We need to challenge them more of, what is this dues, what is this money going towards, but then also ask within ourselves, why are there continually a disproportionate amount of resources, both physically and fiscally, with specific groups of student organizations, and that can even tie in the recognition piece that you briefly mentioned, Connie, because how can we justify sometimes that this particular group deserves whatever outstanding award? Sure, but then we have to ask the question critically of, but how much access to these resources do they have comparatively to XYZ organization that probably work just as hard, but were only able to work within the limits of what we as an institution gave them.
Right, right. Oh, great examples and ideas. And it makes me think about, I think, so certainly well-intentioned people, well-intentioned systems, trying to do the best we can, often without a lot of resources. But I think what I was thinking about when the three of you were sharing your examples is that we've built systems based on a normalized perception of who we think our students are. And so we think that, here's how our students are going to access housing, and here's the process that we want them to go through. Here's how here's how we think students are going to be involved on our campus. And so here are the reward mechanisms that we tie to that. And here's how we set up the money and that kind of thing. And I'm sure there's some degree of truth to that for some population of our students, but, it makes me wonder about how are we also talking about what are our other pathways that are still, what are other students going to be accessing these? And so how may we have systems and policies and procedures in place so that there's multiple entry points into these and multiple ways of recognition and celebration in our students' lives. And then I think about and then there's training. We have to train all of our people all across our organization, not just our student activities or our Res Life folks, but our administrative team and our janitorial and grounds crew and faculty. And so how are, that we have to build this kind of consciousness and continue to share that out so that we are shifting. And it's daunting. And I think what our responsibility is when we're thinking about process and practice. It's not just about the thing, but also about the thing and how it fits in with our culture. And then how do we train and develop so that we're reinforcing the right things? Mm-hmm. So I guess a follow-up question is, so how do we make this happen? What do we need to do? I guess there's the radical in me that says let's overthrow, let's kick everybody else out of office, and have some process to vet everybody back in on that. I know that won't. That's not a practical way. But I'm curious about how do we to all of your points earlier, like how it's the, the incoming generation of professionals, I think, have a perspective that I think the Chief Student Affairs and our longstanding professionals can benefit from to expand their practice. And certainly that there's wisdom that some of us elders, I don't know that I'm an elder, but some of us old people have learned along the way that we can also offer to others. And so, how how are we spreading this kind of idea? How are we connecting? Um, yeah, is it ongoing training? Um, is it a recertification? So I don't. I'm asking that broadly. So anybody want to jump in on that one?
I'll jump in. So
Thank you.
I think it's a little bit of what you said in terms of I think we need to start. It's almost like starting at all angles, right? So we have folks who are already in the field who have already gone. Some have gone through master's programs, some have not. Some have gone through professional institutes. We have all these different ways to prepare people to enter the field, and so part of it is going back to basics and thinking about what are we actually teaching people in these programs? What are higher education, student affairs, counseling, student development programs right now teaching practitioners, and how is that working and how is that not working? And I think I think our professional associations are probably a good place to start in terms of what are the various institutes or ways in which we are providing additional professional development to individuals to say, how can we be doing this differently? How can we be doing this with a different lens, with a different population in mind? Which is why, for me, I've really appreciated identity-based professional development opportunities because oftentimes, other opportunities don't work for me. And so I think, we just need to kind of go back to basics and think about how we're training people, how we're educating people to be practitioners in this field. And we need to kind of get leadership on board. So I think about, our senior student affairs officers and how they're engaging with the profession now. Are they still kind of learning about what the trends are? Are they engaged with professional associations? Do they know we're thinking about this? And really engaging them in the process too, because we need folks at the top to be sharing the good news and getting folks on board as well.
Yeah, I like it. It's how you were talking about that, about really um, encouraging, supporting, and expecting ongoing professional development. And I think at all levels of the profession, it makes me wonder about like how am I being held accountable for my own ongoing development,
Mm-hmm.
and and identifying the gaps that I have as a senior level professional. Who's identifying those? And in some ways I could say my supervisor is, but I think it would be interesting for um, other professionals all across this campus and probably within ACPA to say, Craig, here are some things that we've recognized that you need to develop on or continue to develop on. And then, so that, just a really nice wondering there for me about it. How is that happening? I think it's easy for me to fall into the trap of the supervisor mentor role, to be able to say, like, I'm trying to ensure that all of my team has access to development, but I don't know that I'm considering myself in that loop either. So that's great. Shruti or Gabe, anything you want to add about how do we do this?
I think I think for me, what I would add and kind of a little further, if I may, is I'm going to tie in a few pieces. Craig, you were mentioning just before this question of how exhausting changing some of these systems can be, and then it makes me instantly, as a person of color, think of that exhaustion and the labor and the burden that this has become for many folks within our field. And so I'm trying to tie in this notion of, how do we change this, right? And how do we, help folks understand, particularly I was having this conversation with another colleague from an educational standpoint of, what does, like, helping folks understand the notions of allyship and accompliship and how those go to hand in hand and how critical that is now. Because for some of us, we don't just need you to help us feel safe, we also need you to help dismantle these systems.
Right.
And so I think that's a lesson across different levels of student affairs and higher ed. That is something I think that should be a critical part of our development and our teachings and our knowledge base now. It's because many folks are very tired of having to carry this burden, right? And so, but again, how do we shift that needle to help folks understand that I still think allyship is very important and at its core. But again, how do we introduce this accomplishment and how do we help folks understand how they work in tandem, right? That's my thoughts that I have.
Yeah. No, that's great. And again, I think about how do we help people understand that this system works for none of us.
Mm-hmm.
And it is about, my role in my places of dominance and privilege is not to do it for you or do it. It's to do it for us because it is not working for any of us.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that everybody really always understands that all the time. And so I just that I move away. I mean, so my side soapbox here that I would love to move away from the idea of an ally and more talk about partnership. Like, how am I a part of this on a daily and systematic level, not just about being an ally too.
Yeah, so I'm very cautious in saying this, but I think our field as a whole could use a little dose of humility, and that we don't know all there is to know. I've read a ton of books and done all this work around D&I, and I still microaggress and cause harm in my dominant identities, and
Right.
people forgive me, right? Or people don't forgive me, and I have to do my own work and figure out how not to do that. Be a jerk again tomorrow. But even like going to some of our conferences, there's like a vice president lounge, and like, why is there a vice president lounge? Like those, and most, you look at the data around who's vice presidents, it still reflects most dominant identities. And so, and we're losing new professionals of color at incredible rates. And so what if we rethought that and said, hey, new professionals, like, we know y'all need some space. You're on the front lines. You're also facing race tax, queer tax, gender tax, whatever, and we want to make some space for you. And we shifted the resources of a VP lounge to a something else lounge, right? Or just get rid of the lounge concept altogether. I also think, to Connie's point of how we kind of frame professional development is important. I've heard folks say, like, I couldn't go to SJTI or I couldn't go to a white privilege conference because it's not directly related to my job. And I think until we begin to believe that diversity and inclusion work and reshifting policies and practices is all of our jobs, we're going to continue to Gabe's point of continue to reinforce systems. So let's use professional development in a way, and folks of color need space that they feel heard and valued. Queer folks need that. And the Craig Elliott's of the world need to hear it from the Craig Elliott's of the world, right? I've done my work to try to help the Craig Elliott's of the world, and I'm tired. So I'm going to center myself and find my healing in ways of communities of color that will reinforce me and help me get through the day-to-day so I stay sustained in this field. But I don't know that we as a profession are okay saying, like, white folks, y'all got to help white folks, and people of color, we're going to help each other. And then we're going to ally or work together or partner together to change the system. I think we just want to sing Kumbaya and say we're doing diversity and inclusion work without kind of showing up. Robin DiAngelo just released this great article about how diversity training impacts white folks in a workplace, and I would recommend everyone to read that article because it really is powerful about how it's not an effective thing if we don't do our own work, and how if you can't work on racism if you haven't also worked on how you are reinforcing racist practice.
Yeah, that's great. So thank you for that shout out with the Robin DeAngelo article. We'll put that in our comments,
Cool.
so those that are listening later can grab onto it. But it's certainly a great recommendation. And so again, thank you to the three of you for just sharing so openly and honestly. It makes me think about. So I think bell hooks, and bell hooks. So a couple things. Bell hooks talks about, asks us to refuse privilege at every opportunity, and so how are we using our power and privilege for good, and really being able to refuse unjust practices, and so how do we say no to the lounge idea, or make that a different kind of lounge idea to support something else. But I also this idea of humility and love, and so that again connect with bell hooks and her work about love. So how are we loving each other, and helping each other grow and learn and support and maintain really, I think, important high standards. This is just so how do we, I've been fortunate for the people that have forgiven me and helped me along the way and helped me recognize the places that I step in it. And yet I wonder too, is that a common, how do we build that into this practice as well? So any thoughts from the three of you? Yeah, we're all no.
Big question, Craig.
Oh, sorry. I
Okay.
love pondering the big things, so I apologize for that. We can scale it back.
No, I think there's this Martin Luther King quote, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, and he talks about the necessity of love and justice working together. And I often think about how we want to love people, but if we don't want to be in the fire of justice sometimes. I want to love my trans folks, but when it comes to making sacrifices and standing up for them, do I love them enough to do that? I want to love my undocumented friends, but when it comes to standing up for them, am I willing to do that? And I think the quote, it sits in my dining room, so I'm reminded every day of this need of like, how am I, if I'm loving people, am I also standing for justice for them? And I can do that for my partner or my family, but am I doing that in my dominant identities? Am I willing to give up, to your point of the bell hooks, my privilege and power to stand for justice, and really love folks in this unconditional kind of way, and not in this like, I don't see color, I love everybody type of way, but in this I'm on the ground with folks, partnering, sacrificing way. I don't think as a society we have a lot of phenomenal examples of what that looks like, particularly in the States. But I hope that we as a field could get there. I think we have folks who could help us get there and the right kind of human resources to help us get there.
Right.
Mm-hmm. I'd add to, I really like your point, Shruti, about, the sacrifices that are embedded in justice. And there's a YouTube video that is called, Is Justice Really Worth It? And I would encourage, if we can post that, that would be great. But what the YouTube video really talks about is that when you view someone as part of you, as part of your community, then justice is always worth it. And in order to do that, you need to actually get to know other humans and be in touch with their humanity and know them not just as someone in your community, but really get to know them as an individual. So I think that that's a good place for us to start, is really getting to know those in our community. and how our humanity is directly linked to theirs in some capacity. What I've struggled with in this field, and this is just Connie being real and honest, is that I think that there's a lot of people in this field who do justice work as a work responsibility, and it's actually not part of who they are in their everyday life. And so, you know, they can be a social justice advocate and ally 9 to whenever they're on campus, but are they having these conversations around their dinner table with their family? Are they having these conversations with their friends on the weekends at the bar? Are they still part of the good fight even when they're not wearing their student affairs administrator hat? And that's something that I've really been challenged by, because I do think that we are cultivating a field of professionals who thinks social justice work is part of what I need to do as a competency to get a job, rather than is this directly who I am? And that makes it hard to trust people in this field too. And I'll say that I have colleagues in this field who are like family to me, who I know that they're doing social justice work 24/7. It's not part of their job responsibilities. It's part of who they are. And I think we need to be recruiting and looking for folks in the field who this is part of who they are as humans and not as solely administrators.
Beautiful example that both of you kind of triggered was just a little less than a week ago. Like many cities in the U.S., we had a rally here in Philadelphia, specifically for our trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming folks. And so one of the things that stood out to me was one, and some of this is paraphrasing for language, but we were reminded that these folks are still here. That was a huge, impactful moment over and over, and I love that. But more importantly, number two was we were challenged by one of the speakers to not go back to our regularly scheduled programming. And I love that because, Connie, it kind of goes to what you were saying of it's social justice work or advocacy is not a 9 to 5 thing. And so what are we doing outside of that, right? How are we engaging? And even, and one of the third piece that I'm recalling is they even challenge us to think, and I say this again because it's, I think, an appropriate space to do so. Yes, go out and vote, right? Like we can tie that in all we want, but it's more than just that. So what else are you doing that's both small and large scale in ensuring that we are, you know, doing justice work outside of just a checklist, so to speak. And that, I think, was very, very eye-opening for me, even for myself, right? Like we're all coming from a place of transparency. Helped me take some reflective thoughts back home of what am I doing, right, on the weekends, in my social circles, with family, with the holidays coming up, you know, how am I intertwining, you know, as much as I can, this concept of justice work beyond just those whom I consider to be very close affectionately, whether that's a partner or a close group of best friends. How do I expand these conversations beyond that, so to speak? And so I really appreciate that setting and that space last week that really, one can hope that opened a lot of hearts and minds in different ways. And I think is a message that we all need to hear.
Yeah. Well, and I love that. I mean, so you're right. I think all of us here, I think, are consistent and clear about wanting people in our lives and professionals to be exhibiting these competencies in all aspects of their lives, not just when you show up to work. And it reminded me, I think I want to see certainly equity and justice in my colleagues' lives, not just at work. And I also want to see, you know, as I just looked up the professional competencies, I want to see ethics. And I also want to see that learning-centered behaviors, that we truly see ourselves as educators, not just when we show up for work, but when I'm driving to work or when I'm in my community. And, you know, I think these other competencies that we have, these are not just additive things to the way we do our job. These are the ways we do our job. And so how are we reminding folks of that? of those expectations, and reminding ourselves about that it is important for me, not just for how I show up on campus, but how I show up on social media or in my commute home, um, or in the way I'm with my kids and my neighbors' kids, and um, how I go to the grocery store. Like all of that matters just as much as how it matters in my work on campus.
Can I jump
So
in
I
real
just,
quick? Go
yeah,
ahead.
for sure. I just want to do a plug. We are ready for people to jump in and throw some comments in there and ask us questions as well. So feel free when you're ready, drop a comment in there and we will respond to it as it comes in. So thank you.
So real quick, just you're about like we want this to be more than our jobs. When I was at working Res Life, we would ask folks in our interview process, like, can you define racism and can you define privilege? And I would say about 50% of folks couldn't define either one of those. And I think as a
Mm,
field, like if we can't name those two things and define them and say this is what it is, I don't know how we're gonna even start addressing them. Like everyone wants to talk about diversity and inclusion, but like one-on-one stuff, we can't dismantle this if we can't name it and address it.
right. Well, yeah. And how do we, yeah, that's, I'm struck by my own wondering about that. Like that's huge. That is not just about training for a skill set. That is about training for a way of being.
And it even translates the other thing that I'll plug in, and these are small examples, and it was actually brought up in we had a professional development session recently of the balancing act of our roles, right? And it made me, and I'm tying this previous question into this as well, is what are sometimes even the smallest things? They may seem small in nature, but that when we do our work with students and our fellow colleagues, of how is that interpreted? And I say that of like because we have such a busy culture or nature within student affairs and higher ed of as simple as and I appreciated folks in that space that were vulnerable and being honest of sometimes when that one email comes through while you're in the middle of a one-on-one and you feel like you have to look or answer, like it's the small things, but again, it's going back to the fundamentals of empathy and how are we practicing that within our field, because in that moment what that person across from me is sharing could be something of the most vulnerable nature that they've ever told somebody, and now what kind of like subtle message did I just send to them? And I know that that's not those aren't isolated instances that happen, right? Like I think it happens across multiple levels of professionals and in our field. And so how are we checking ourselves in those small little habits that become behaviors, and then because ultimately, how could that have been seen as dismissive and not empathetic?
When I think about it, it made me think about to the small things matter about, one of the things that is really important to me as I walk in the world is to look at people in the eyes as we pass by and like genuinely, hi, how are you doing? Um, and it can't always be like that I've stopped and that I wait for the answer to really know how somebody is, um, but that powerful moment of looking somebody in the eye and saying, I see you, matters. And it matters not just when I'm on campus. It is, um, it truly is, walking down the street, getting a cup of coffee, holding the door for somebody, um, how I'm with my kids. I think sometimes too, I've wondered about, um, how these kind of normative behaviors really, show up in parenting as well. And so you're really constantly challenging myself to say, how am I seeing my kids as, their own people, not just as smaller, lesser beings. And so how are we creating space to honor voices, and see people? All right, so just checking in. So here is a question. for us. So what do we think the next iteration of student affairs looks like? Is it, as Shruti started us off, is it replacing all the plumbing? And unless you were to look underneath the house, you would know it. Or is there some significant rebuilding? How do we transform physical spaces to match the emotional and spiritual spaces that we have? So just thoughts on what the next iteration might be. And Gabe, can I ask you to just jump in there to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I think I touched on this a little bit earlier, the next iteration and what that looks like is really from step one, right? Like like I mentioned earlier, for many folks that go the route of going into a master's program, looking at almost like sitting down with every single possible document imaginable. What in our current in this current state of student affairs and working higher education, considering all the both internal and external factors, what are the fundamental pieces that as emerging professionals and practitioners that we need to know, right, in order to move about the cabin, so to speak, right? And so what do we know about our current and our most newest population of students, knowing that there's a new generation entering, and what new challenges does that bring into our work, and how are we ensuring that, again, our newer professionals, I'm going to amend that and say that all professionals have a foundational knowledge of those issues and how we navigate those conversations. How are we challenging our senior leadership to ensure that policy, and I know we addressed some of the challenges there, but policies and practices are reflective of who is now in our doors and in our walls here in higher education. And so to me, that's where I think the next iteration. I know that's like very big picture, but that's my initial thoughts that come to mind.
Mm-hmm. I think this is probably a little bit more practical in terms of what I hope student affairs will have a little bit more understanding of too, is that I think in student affairs we can operate sometimes in a silo, and we do our own thing within the institution. We're good at what we do, and we kind of stick there. I think student affairs practitioners really need to get a better understanding of the K through 12 system and how that systematically sets us up, because then we'll have a better understanding of the students that we're getting and the students that we're not getting. I always think about, I love my work in student affairs, but I feel really limited by it because we're actually only getting to work with a small percentage of the population who's actually gotten through our doors. So I think we need to have a better understanding of K through 12. I think we need to have a better understanding of our communities, how funding works in our community. So that's one piece. And the other practical component that I think student affairs practitioners, I would hope have some more understanding on is how our work is deeply connected to other operations in the college or university setting. So, I think it's, I didn't learn a lot about how finances worked at an institution. And when you think about how white privilege and lots of other different types of privilege are upheld through how we allocate funds, like those are things that we as student affairs practitioners need to learn. So I think for me, the next iteration of student affairs practitioners has a more holistic view of education within the institutional setting, but also education at large. Remembering that we are one small piece of the education system, that there's so much more that happens in the lives of our students before they even get to us, if they can get to us.
Great. And I think, what I hear both of you talking about is that the evolution of our profession, maybe the revolution of the profession. That might be another webinar about, is it evolution or revolution? So definitely we'll set that one up. But like really, I think shifting the paradigm about what our practice and profession is about. And it makes me, I think that how do we, there is some connection there to this idea that we're here to guide and serve um, and educate students and those around us, but it's how are we rethinking who those students are and what those practices are, so that we might do that differently. Yeah, that's great. Shruti, any ads that you want to contribute?
No, I think my colleagues did a good job.
Excellent.
Only some time if
Thank
there's
you.
other questions too. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So checking, we don't have any questions yet, but that's okay. We'll keep rocking and rolling here. So I think about, and also just recognizing time, we have just about 8 minutes left. So this has gone very quickly and very wonderfully. Um, so how about this? How about we begin our wrap up with a question about us looking back at where we started, and what do we all wish that we knew about what it means to be a student affairs educator, holding all of the things we just talked about, like um, that identities matter, and that ethics matter, and finance matters, and there's systems, it's individual work and it's systems, um, and that we're also recognizing that we need to evolve the profession. So holding all of that, what do we wish that we knew when we were just starting out? I mean, Shruti, I know your time limited, so I'd
Yeah.
just love to have you start with that, and then you
Okay.
can feel free to
Did,
pop off.
sorry, I switched time zones and got messed up. So yeah, I mean, I think for me as a queer woman of color, that I think I entered the field a little naively of like, this place, student affairs is going to treat me well because we value diversity and inclusion. Higher ed's going to be this like safe space, and I have had to fight like hell to take care of myself, to climb the ladder, to live my values, to not let the day-to-day kind of microaggressions and get in my way, and to keep standing on like making my own meaning of my values. And I've surrounded myself to carrying this out day to day and not just doing this as a resume builder or something else. Because if you're not standing for me in like the private world, I don't need you in the professional world. And so I think I think for people who are entering our field, like, keep fighting. It will build and it will sustain you, and you will be okay. And I do have to
Great.
hop off, so thank you, Craig and Connie and Gabe. It was great hanging out with y'all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Take
Thank you,
care.
Shruti. All right. So Connie or Gabe, are either one of you ready to jump in?
I mean, I don't think that there's anything that could have prepared me for this moment right now in higher ed. I really don't. I think about the challenges that we're facing on our campuses right now, and I think about, I graduated, grad school 10 years ago, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure there's anything that could have prepared me for this moment. Instead of, I did a master's in counseling, and so for me that was really important. That those are the skills I use every single day, and I'm so glad I did a master's in counseling. But I do think that if I look back, and if there were kind of components that I feel like I wish I were trained better on, is understanding institutional governance. I think now, in a position where I'm reporting to our president, that's become really important for me to understand, and to think about the ways in which institutional governance actually upholds white supremacy every day. And so for me, that's something that I wish I knew a little bit more about. But yeah, I would say, to Shruti's point, I am, it's taken me a lot of time to figure out, not, well, I wouldn't say a lot of time, but it's taken me some time to figure out, what my boundaries in this field are, and how I can maintain, self-care and practices that feel good to me, so that I can come to work every day and be the best person for myself, for my students, for my family. because this is really hard work right now, and I think we're at the crux of a really hard time and sad time in our nation's history, and the work we're doing is so essential and important. Um, so yeah, I think that those are some things that I wish I had learned along the way. And I hope, and I would assume that some of our folks that are coming up the pipeline right now, myself included, are learning those as well, but definitely something I wish I had given more thought to.
Great points. Thank you. Gabe,
Yeah.
how about you?
Yeah, I echo a lot of the things that were said so far. I think, I don't know if it's necessarily what I wish I would have known, but what I am hopeful to see change is sometimes the messages that we do send our young and emerging professionals in the field. And I say that because there have been instances where either myself or other colleagues have heard phrases of doing our time and paying our dues. And I think that is a very dangerous and borderline toxic mindset to send our young professionals when you factor in the things that Shruti and Connie just mentioned, as a queer person of color myself, and how exhausting our work already is. Like, to hear that just makes me feel like I have to carry the burden even more, and that like I have something to prove to you. And so I am hopeful that at least at bare minimum that kind of mentality can begin to disappear from our narrative, because I think that if it doesn't, the burnout rates that we see and departures from higher ed student affairs will continue to escalate and exist. And so I think that's one thing I did, in a sense, yeah, wish I would have known. But how can you know something sometimes until you experience it, as they say? So that first instance that pops in my head, I was like, well, welcome. All right. But again, for those that are up and coming folks just like myself, the same thing that Shruti said, just keep fighting. It's exhausting. Know what your boundaries are, just like Connie mentioned. It took me a while to really know that, and to know what are my negotiables and non-negotiables, and to be transparent about that, because if someone's not willing to, I guess, really see eye to eye with those pieces, then I think there's a deeper critical question of, is that really the right place for you? And that's okay to ask that question. That's my other advice to young professionals, is that it's okay to have that question, whether that is prior to the offer or at some point during your experience. No one says that you have to stay in a place and carry a burden just because you have to pay dues, right? So I think now more than ever, I challenge our young professionals to really challenge what, if you can, during hiring processes or at some point once you're in an experience, of really establishing those boundaries, right? And being able to not succumb, right, to any type of pressure that you feel like could impact your health, right? Whether that's your mental health, physical health, etc. And so I really do mean that. And so making sure to, while we are always excited for new opportunities in our field, whether that's faux upward movement or across a different functional area, but to continue, if you have already done so, but to ask those critical questions throughout different processes and during your experience.
Yeah, that's great.
And if I can just add,
and it reminds me
thing,
too. Yeah, go ahead.
I feel like I need to say this. I think as a field too, we need to be compensating people appropriately, because what I also see happening is everybody in student affairs has a side hustle right now because people can't make ends meet with the current salaries that they're given, which is mind-boggling to me. And so I think that that's adding to some of the stress in the field, is that even when people are not working, they have to work. And so I think that we as a field need to really revisit how we're compensating individuals. For someone who's in an RD position, who's already working over 40 hours a week and has to pick up another job just to make some money, what are we doing? We're asking for burnout in our field of really talented people. And so I think that's something that we need to seriously think about. and pay graduate students.
There you go. Yes, exactly. Well, and and recognizing and acknowledging the economic realities of our times, and how are we providing compensation in another way, or to be able to offset that. So great points, both of you. So I would add, I think that what I wish I know, if I was talking to my younger self, in addition to the things you're talking about, I would say, first thing is show up. I always show up. Nobody told me that, and it took me a long time to figure it out. But that showing up always matters, and people care less about my fiscal savviness, although that matters. But it's more about how am I showing up and where am I showing up and how am I being present and engaged with that. And I think the second piece that I wish I knew is find your community. Those are for all the stresses and all the BS, but also all the wonderful things. And there's really been my community of people that have also helped me survive that and thrive in that. And so just another last piece of offer. Just continue to. We don't have to do this alone, and I think we do ourselves a disservice, and we do our students a disservice when we continue to try to think of that we are lone warriors in the midst of this. That we need that community. So I see that we're out of time, and so I just Connie, Gabe, any last thoughts that you want to throw out there before we wrap up? Okay. No, just so thankful to you, Gabe, and you, Connie, and Shruti, for your brilliance and wisdom and ongoing practice and the work that you're doing on campus and the work that you are doing in ACPA and other associations as we continue to partner and grow. I'm saying thankful for this time to just share it with you. And so as I started, you both and Shruti are really the bright stars of our upcoming generation of professionals. And so keep up your great work. Thank you all to those of us who joined us live and those that are watching us later. Just grateful for the time. Just shout out, we'll be continuing these conversations at ACPA Boston and ACPA Nashville, and also doing some deep dives in other professional development opportunities. So I know some things are happening now with the Senior Student Affairs Institute happening now, and then there's the Mid-Level Managers Institute coming up in January. We'll be continuing to explore how to help transform the next iteration of student affairs. So thank you all for your attention. Have a wonderful day, and thank you.